Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's dive in. We're tackling the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom today. You know, the one with MLK's I Have a Dream speech.
Sure do.
But we're going deeper than just that iconic speech, right?
Absolutely. We've got some amazing excerpts from a history podcast that'll give us the full picture.
Awesome. So when we think about this march, we usually think about the civil rights movement.
Right.
But I was reading that it actually had some roots in something else, something maybe a little unexpected.
Yeah, it did. This event, so central to the civil rights movement, actually started way back in the labor movement.
Oh, wow. Okay, so back it up for me a little bit. Like, how far back are we talking?
We're talking World War II. Philip Randolph, a major labor leader, he was already thinking about a march on Washington then.
Wow. What was the goal way back then?
Well, it was all about jobs. He wanted to pressure the government, make sure Black Americans got fair treatment in the defense industry.
Makes sense. A booming industry with lots of jobs, and he wanted to ensure Black Americans had a fair shot at those jobs.
Exactly. Randolph, he was brilliant. He knew true equality meant fixing those economic gaps, the ones at the heart of racial injustice.
So even back then, it wasn't just about some vague idea of equality. It was about concrete economic opportunities.
100%. He was pushing for tangible stuff, jobs, fair pay. He wanted Black Americans to share in the nation's prosperity.
It sounds like he was really ahead of his time. So that lays the groundwork for what would become the 1963 March, right? But I read that not everyone was totally on board with the idea of a march, even among civil rights leaders.
You're right.
Like Roy Wilkins from the NAACP, he wasn't so sure about it, was he?
He wasn't. Wilkins was really worried about backlash, He thought there could be violence from segregationists.
And given what some of those groups were doing at the time, it's not hard to see why he was so concerned. I mean, fire hoses, police dogs, bombings, those were terrifying times.
Absolutely. His concerns were very real. It shows the incredible courage it took for those leaders to keep pushing for change in that environment.
Right. They're putting their lives on the line for what they believed in.
You really were. They had to weigh the potential good of the march against the real dangers. It wasn't an easy choice.
I can't even imagine. Oh, wow. But thankfully, they did move forward.
Yeah.
Fast forward to 1963, and we have this group, the Big Six. They're the ones who really made the march happen. We're talking Randolph, King, James Farmer, John Lewis, Wilkins, and Whitney Young. A powerhouse lineup.
For sure.
What was King's vision for this?
King, he saw this march as a way to bring everyone together again. The movement was kind of fractured at the time.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, things weren't moving as fast as people wanted, and some were questioning the whole nonviolence strategy.
Yeah.
So King thought a massive peaceful protest, that could re-energize everyone, show their commitment to nonviolence.
Powerful stuff. It's fascinating how, even within the movement itself, there were these different opinions and strategies being debated. It wasn't this simple, unified front that we sometimes imagine. Of course, then the march happens, and it's this huge event. Over 250,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial, and a quarter of them are white. That's pretty amazing for the time.
Yeah, it really showed the growing support for civil rights, from people of all races.
Right.
And that diversity, that was totally intentional. They wanted to make it clear that this wasn't just a Black thing.
It was an American thing.
Exactly. They had everyone there. Clergy, union workers, politicians, even celebrities, all sorts of people, all united in their call for justice.
Wow, what an image. But organizing something that huge in such a tense time, that must have been a logistical nightmare. How did they manage to keep it peaceful?
It took a ton of planning, that's for sure. They strategically placed marshals throughout the crowd to keep things calm.
Smart.
And they worked really closely with law enforcement to be sure everything was secure.
And they kept stressing the importance of nonviolence.
Oh, definitely. They told everyone to stay calm no matter what. It was amazing. Such a balancing act, pushing for change but keeping the peace in a climate that was anything but peaceful.
Incredible. Now, obviously, we can't talk about this march without talking about King's I Have a Dream speech.
Oh, yeah, definitely not.
It's become such a symbol, a symbol of hope and equality. But here's something I bet a lot of people don't know.
Uh-oh, you got a trivia question for me?
Maybe. The dream part of the speech, the part everyone remembers, it wasn't even in the original script.
Oh, that's right.
Seriously, can you believe that?
Yeah. Mahalia Jackson, the amazing gospel singer, she was there. And she supposedly shouted to King, "Tell him about the dream."
No way.
Yeah. And so right there, King just went off script and delivered that incredibly powerful, improvised passage.
Chills. That's history being made right there. Who knew? But the march wasn't just about inspiring speeches, was it?
Nope, not at all.
The theme itself, jobs and freedom, tells us they had specific things they wanted to achieve.
Absolutely. They were shining a light on the economic inequalities that were at the root of all this racial injustice.
Yeah.
They knew real equality meant tackling these huge disparities.
So, beyond those broad appeals for jobs and freedom, what specific economic demands did they make? What concrete changes were they pushing for?
Oh, they had a whole list. A federal jobs program for everyone who was unemployed, a higher minimum wage, desegregated schools and public places. They understood that real equality meant addressing those basic needs.
Wow, they were thinking big. It wasn't just about feel-good vibes. They were after systemic change.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to see how historians have interpreted the march over the years. There's no one right answer about its impact.
Right, different perspectives and all that.
Exactly. You've got some historians, the traditional ones, they see it as this massive victory for peaceful protest, a turning point that helped lead to those landmark civil rights laws.
Right, the power of unity and nonviolence winning the day. That classic narrative.
Exactly. But then you have other historians, sometimes called radicals. They critique the march, say it focused too much on compromise and integration, without really addressing the deep-rooted economic inequality and racism.
So they're saying it didn't go far enough in challenging the power structures that were causing these problems.
Exactly. Then there's the continuity group. They see the March on Washington as just one part of a much longer fight for civil rights.
Ah, so it's all connected, building on what came before and paving the way for what came after.
Precisely. It's less about the march itself and more about its place in that broader story of the fight for racial justice.
Gotcha. I bet the social historians have a whole other take on this. What's their angle?
They're all about the grassroots, the everyday people.
Hmm.
The untold stories of all those people who worked so hard to make the march happen.
Yeah. Those are the unsung heroes, the ones who don't always get the credit.
Right. They show us that it really does take a village to make a movement.
Absolutely. And that's something to keep in mind as we continue to explore the impact of this incredible event.
It's easy to get caught up in the big speeches and all the famous people, but the real power of the March on Washington, I think it's in that collective spirit.
Yeah.
Thousands of people came from all over the country. They organized, they mobilized, they all believed in a better future.
Absolutely. Their stories are important, and their work made a difference. Okay, so we have this amazing moment of unity and purpose, but what happened after? Did things actually change? Did they get those jobs and freedom?
Well, about 2 months after the March tragedy struck, President Kennedy was assassinated.
Oh, man.
It was devastating for everyone, and it really slowed down any progress on civil rights.
Wow, what a horrible setback. All that energy, all that hope, and then suddenly everything changes.
It was a huge loss. But even with this tragedy, the fight didn't stop Lyndon B. Johnson. He took over as president, and he was really moved by the march and its message.
So even though Kennedy dying was a major blow, the movement was still strong.
Exactly. And Johnson was a smart politician. He saw that energy and he used it. The grief, the need for change, he used it all to push for the Civil Rights Act. He said it would be a tribute to Kennedy.
So the march, even though it didn't directly lead to the act, it helped create the conditions for it to happen.
Exactly. The public was demanding justice. The movement was so powerful, and the March on Washington amplified all of that.
Yeah.
It made passing the Civil Rights Act a political necessity.
Makes sense. And then in 1964 it happened, discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, all of it became illegal.
Yeah, it was a major victory for the movement and for America.
Huge. But I imagine passing a law doesn't magically fix everything, right? I mean, centuries of systemic racism and inequality doesn't just disappear overnight.
You're right. The Civil Rights Act was a huge step forward. It provided a legal basis to fight segregation and discrimination, but it was just one step.
Okay, so it was a big legal win, but the fight for true equality was far from over.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There was, and sadly still is, a long way to go. The movement faced new problems and disagreements as they pushed for more progress. Things like voting rights, economic justice, ending police brutality.
It makes me think about King's I Have a Dream speech. It's so powerful, but did it have a lasting impact beyond that day? Or was it just a beautiful speech that people forgot about?
It became much more than just a speech. It turned into a symbol of the whole civil rights movement.
Yeah.
It represented the power of nonviolent resistance and the dream of a just and equal society.
And people still quote it today. It still inspires people all over the world.
Exactly. The message of hope. unity, that unwavering belief in equality, it all still resonates. It reminds us that the fight for justice never ends.
So even though there were challenges, even though there were disagreements, King's words gave people hope.
They did. But it's important to remember that the unity you saw at the March on Washington didn't last forever. As the movement went on, new voices and ideas came up, and sometimes those differences caused tension and arguments.
I guess that makes sense. Movements change, strategies change, and like we talked about before, there were different opinions within the movement even before the march.
Right.
Can you give me an example of how those differences played out after the March on Washington?
Sure. As the fight for equality continued, some activists, especially younger people, got impatient. They felt that nonviolent resistance wasn't working fast enough to break down the systems of oppression.
Yeah, they wanted faster change. I get it.
Exactly. They started pushing for stronger tactics, even more militant ones. They thought real liberation required a more aggressive approach. And this created debate within the movement about the best way forward.
So do they stick with nonviolence or do they fight back harder? It's a tough question.
Yeah, and it's a question that goes beyond just the civil rights movement. You see these same debates happening in social justice movements today.
That's true. The legacy of the March on Washington and the entire civil rights movement, it goes way beyond those specific events. It shapes how we think about activism, social change, and the fight for equality in all its forms. It reminds us that fighting for justice is a constant process, a never-ending conversation about how to make real change. And sometimes the strongest movements are the ones that include all kinds of voices and ideas, even when those ideas challenge the norm. So we've looked at where the march came from, who the key players were, the imagery, the impact on laws, the ripple effects throughout history, the different ways historians see it. What's the takeaway for our listeners? What's the big so what?
The big takeaway, I think, is that the March on Washington wasn't just a one-time thing. It represented decades of activism and struggle. It pushed for changes in laws, and it inspires people to this day.
Yeah, it reminds us that progress takes work planning and the guts to challenge the way things are. And even when there are setbacks and disagreements, the fight for justice has to keep going.
Right. And it also makes us think about those big questions about movements.
Yeah.
How do we create real lasting change? How do we handle disagreements and different points of view? And how do we make sure the fight for equality stays relevant and powerful for future generations?
Yeah, it's like we peeled back all the layers of this historical event and saw how complicated and messy social change really is. There's no simple answer.
And that brings us to a question for our listeners. Something to really think about as they consider what the March on Washington means and how it relates to the world today.
All right, give it to us. What's the question?
Well, think about the main themes of the 1963 March: jobs, freedom, equality.
Okay.
How do those connect with the social justice movements happening right now today?
Ooh, that's a good one. It makes you think about how those fights for justice change over time, how the struggle continues, but in different ways.
Exactly. We see those same ideas and movements for racial justice, economic equality, climate change, LGBTQ plus rights, all of it. That fight for a better world, it's not over.
It makes you realize that the March on Washington, it wasn't just a moment in history. It was the start of so many other movements and fights.
Like a ripple effect going on and on.
Exactly.
It's about realizing that the fight for justice is like a relay race. Each generation, they take the baton, carry it forward, and pass it on.
And they learn from the people who came before, change their strategies, find new ways to fight for that better future.
Yeah, that's it. It's not just about looking back and saying, wow, they did great things.
Right.
It's about taking inspiration from their courage, their vision, and their dedication to justice.
And then using those lessons for the problems we face now.
Exactly. The March on Washington, it's a model for how to be an activist, how to organize, how to make change happen.
It shows us that when people come together, they can make a difference, even when things seem impossible.
Yeah.
This deep dive has been amazing. We went deep, explored all the angles, the different opinions, the impact it had. It wasn't just about King's dream speech. We got the whole story, the good and the bad.
And I hope it made you want to learn more about this history.
Yeah.
The civil rights movement was so important, and there's still so much to discover.
Totally. Keep digging, keep asking questions, keep learning.
Because to understand the present and change the future, we got to know the past. We all have a part to play in this fight for justice.
Wow, that's powerful.
So keep those brains working and keep fighting the good fight.
Absolutely. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.